Welcome back, folks. This is second in a three-part series on writing processes that you'll use for writing your term papers in university or college. I think it's also a helpful series if you're a high school student who's, worried about your end-of-year exams, or you're in English language arts, or you're in social studies and you're wondering about how to write effectively, how to develop good writing practices. This series is for you. Okay, so today we're going to focus on working with writing processes. So let's remember that the writing process is not being practiced when you write your paper the night before it's due. Right? So if you're doing that, that's not good writing practice. It's akin to saying, I want to eat well, but you go to McDonald's. Or, I want to eat well, but you sit on the couch eating chips. It's akin to that. You have to take some time to shop around for your good ingredients. You have to go take some time to cook. You have to, there is a kind of a process that you have to practice. If you're serious, if you care about your writing and becoming a better writer, you can't just write your stuff the night before it's due. Okay? The writing process is not being practiced when you skip pre-writing, when you do not draft, revise, or engage in editing. You're not going to be able to do that stuff if you do it the night before. Right? That's not to say that good things haven't been written on the fly. Just think of all the songs that you've ever heard, rock and roll songs that are masterful works of, art, right? These things pour out on the page just all at once too, right? But also there's a kind of a gift that authors like that have that probably very well, they've been cultivating for a great long time through always writing and writing and writing and writing. And, you may not be like that. So, if you're new to writing, if you're feeling, that you struggle with writing, this is advice for you to remember, okay? So, you need to start practicing pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing. And the writing process is not being practiced when you simply treat whatever thoughts you put down on the page as the finished product. This happens so much, right? Oh, well, I finished up my essay now. It's done. Well, no, it's not. You have to understand that, once a thing's written, it's not necessarily finished. It's good to get your first bit of writing done, but you want to leave yourself some time so that you can actually give yourself some distance from it, so that you can come back to it with fresh eyes, reread it. Often it's very handy to read things aloud that you've read, and you'll start to hear, dissonances in it. You'll start to hear things that don't make sense, or you'll even notice that there will be areas in it that are weakly argued, those sorts of things. So, but we're trained in school, right, to think, when I'm done my essay, I hand it to the professor or the teacher, I get a grade, next, right? That's kind of crap pedagogy. That's typically what happens in schools. Good pedagogy, if it was serious, if your professors or teachers were serious about writing, they would say, okay, well, maybe you write a paper, or you write a draft of a paper, you hand that in, you get comments on it, you get questions about it, you get, a certain amount of interrogation around it, suggestions. These things are handed back to you, and then it's given, the ball's back in your court, and then you go back and you edit, and you enter into a kind of a process with your tutor, or with your teacher, or with your professor, and that's how you promote writing processes. So, the blame's not all with you guys as students, it's actually with teachers as well. The responsibility for writing processes is also to teach writing processes, and plainly that's not done as well as it ought to be done either in high school or elementary school, college or university. What would that look like in practice? Probably what would happen is you'd have a heck of a lot less term papers, wouldn't you? You might have a lot less of them, but the one that you did have, or the two that you did have, you would have went through some writing processes with it. So writing as process. When we want to learn how to write, we must think of writing as a process, right? There's your writing process right there. You move from pre-writing to drafting, to revising, to editing, to your final copy. After we have written a paper for class, it's good for us to think about and learn from any comments provided by our teachers or instructors that will help us learn how to improve for next time. I mean, I get students who are shocked and appalled by, how much I'll write on student papers. Now, why do I do that? Because I had some really great professors when I was in undergrad. I was very lucky to have had such people who took the time to not just write, good job at the end of a paper, or, don't quit your day job, or just scrawl a A or a B or a C or an F or whatever, but they actually took time to help me with my writing. That's invaluable. But, people in school, very often, they're not used to that. And then when they get lots of feedback back from a teacher or a professor, they can have a hairy canary conniption fit, too, about it, right? So, one thing, if you're an instructor, you want to, advise students that, if you're going to help them with writing processes, you want them to know that, I'm going to write lots on your papers. And it doesn't mean you suck. It means I'm trying to help you. Okay? So as you work on becoming a better writer, don't expect overnight results. Learning to write takes much time and patience, much practice and diligence. Don't be discouraged if your rewards as a writer are incremental rather than great leaps. Learning to write is like that. So again, right, I used to tell my high school students this. Every paper that we did in my class, there was, I would mark it all up for you, give you lots of comments on it, give it back to you. You'd have a period of about a week usually to, if you wanted to rewrite it in some fashion, right? But then don't expect your mark to shoot up like a rocket, because writing doesn't work that way. Improvement in writing doesn't work that way. It's incremental. It's little baby steps. The only time, really, when you go from having, a really lousy, mark outcome to a much better one is when the first time around you completely miss the boat. Like in the first lecture in this series, when I was saying it's important for you to answer the question, understand that you answer make sure that you understand what question is being asked, and then respond to that one. If you didn't, then chances are you're going to get a horrendous mark, right? And then on your rewrite, it could be much, much better simply because you actually addressed the question. So sometimes, there are great leaps like this, but normally that's just because there's been some deep, fundamental, drastic error at the beginning, whereas mostly it's just little tiny baby steps. And you have to be patient, and you have to be diligent, and you have to practice as a writer. Now, we talked about this in the first lecture, right? So getting started with pre-writing tools and strategies, getting started or putting down on paper what you know using brainstorming devices like scattergrams, planning charts, clusters, mind maps, free writing. These are all different techniques that you can use to engage in pre-writing. We're not going to talk about those right now because we already spoke about them. What about drafting your paper, right? What is the form that's being required of you, and who is your audience? These are important things to consider when you're drafting your paper. What form is being required of you, and who is your audience, right? Is there a prescribed form your paper must take? Did your professor or instructor provide you with a template or exemplars? I know this to be the case even when I first went away to university. I could scrawl off a pretty decent paper in religious studies, but then I'd take that same attitude with me to, say, an English class or anthropology or something like this. And whatever I was doing really well in religious studies was just simply not flying in this other so-called discipline, right? So you have to be able to understand who your audience is and what the expectations are around the kinds of papers and the kinds of writing and the formalities that they require that maybe aren't required in other disciplines. Like, I'm teaching right now at a place called Ambrose University College. And last year, I went around to the various departments with a little survey, just asking, what kinds of writing assignments do you do in your particular department, right? And so there's the different kinds of writing assignments in English, and there's the ones in Christian studies, and there's the ones in business admin and music and psychology. And on the next page, you can see, biology has different kinds of writing assignments, as does history, as does mathematics, and as do we in education, right? So, but each one of these, there are different expectations around how you're going to write, the particular form or structure of the things you're going to write, maybe the voice or the tone of what you're going to write, maybe even expectations around, how grammatical this thing needs to be, how well documented this thing needs to be, right? So you have to understand all that and who your audience is, right, before you can sit down to actually draft your paper. If you don't quite get what those things are, you need to find out so that you can write a good product. Okay? Now again, here's the the basic 5-paragraph essay form, and I mentioned this earlier. I said how, many times English teachers poo-poo this because they it makes for crap writing. Well, actually, it doesn't really. If you encounter the basic 5-paragraph essay form early on in your writing career, especially when you're early on in high school and you don't know what it means to write an essay, and you don't know what it means to formulate an argument, you don't know how to structure an argument, having a basic understanding of this kind of a simple skeleton is the building block that you can start from, right? Some people don't need the 5-paragraph essay form. In fact, by college and university, I think that a large number of people are able and feel competent enough to leave it behind. But still, it's a good tool. And if you're new to writing, or maybe you're coming back to school after a long hiatus, right, out in the workforce, and now you've taken that big step in your life to go and get some more education, and you're nervous about it because you haven't written anything in 15, 20 years, this is a good place to start, just to get your motor running again. So just keep that in mind, and then once you feel confident with it, abandon it, just like the boat in the story I was telling you earlier. Learning to write an effective essay is good for you, right? What will it do? I mean, here's a simple argument taking the 5-paragraph essay form, right, where you've got your thesis. There's your thesis at the top, and then 3 premises, and each of them are supported, and then they drive on to a conclusion, right? Why is it good for you? Well, it will improve your ability to reason, your ability to communicate, and your marks. And then underneath there's different supporting evidence for each of those claims and the conclusion, you see. So, and the value of something like this is that you understand, well, each of my 3 premises there are distinct from one another, right? I'm not saying the same thing 3 times. I'm actually saying 3 different things. And not only that, but I'm not getting my evidence for the first premise and the second premise and the third premise all jumbled in places where they don't belong. Like, evidence for the third premise isn't underneath the first premise, and evidence for the second premise isn't underneath the third premise. No, you've kind of sorted them out, right? Like sorting your laundry. So this is a form that it's a nice scaffold it's a support for learning, right? You can sit down, think about the 5-paragraph essay theme when you're drafting your paper. It doesn't mean that you need 5 paragraphs. Obviously, it can take quite a while to investigate how a reason improves, right? Or how communication is improved, or how marks improve. But that's the basic form that is taught in high school that you could then develop more in your college or university papers. Okay, so there's the basic form you learned in high school. A little template that I used to give students, not every student, but students that I found struggled with, structure, especially structure. Structure is something that doesn't come natural to students. They have to learn it. So, if you find that you're getting your marks back or your papers back and your professor or your teacher is saying your work's all convoluted and I can't follow your argumentation and it's like stream of consciousness, or you find yourself looking at your paper and it's all one big long paragraph, right? Use something like this, and it will help you make your argument much more clear, not just for your audience, but in your own mind as well. So your task, that's all kind of high school stuff, right? But your task at post-secondary is going beyond the 5-paragraph essay structure. Well, how do you do that? Well, what's your topic? What do various people say about it? Do some research. Conduct a literature review. Look for the most influential articles. Look for articles that represent the major positions in the field, right? So, typically what you'll find, you're into a topic that hopefully is of interest to you, right? And you'll go, you'll read as much as you can about that, and you'll find that, there are kind of schools of thought on that particular item, or there are recurring emphases within that idea, right? Like this number of authors all generally kind of accent this one particular aspect of the idea, whereas these other ones don't. And then you'll see recurring sorts of arguments made. You'll see recurring evidence being used, and you'll get a sense of who the big shooters are too, right? So after you've done a little bit of lit review like that, that's what you want to kind of sort those things out. Like, look for the big sweeping ideas there, and also in among those big players and big ideas and controversies, where does your paper fit in relation to all those things, right? So you have your introductory paragraph where you have your thesis, any definitions of major terms, etc., right? Then you have your lit review where you go into this. You talk about the big players, big ideas, controversies, where your paper fits in situation to those things. Then you move on to your premises, your various premises that develop your particular stance. All right. So how does your stance fit in this review? Where does it agree? Where does it disagree? What does your stance add? Let's see here. There we go. Number 3, beefing up your various premises in support of your thesis. So is a single paragraph really enough to elucidate your premise fully? Back in high school, maybe that's all that was being required of you when you were formulating arguments. They just basically were concerned to see, can you follow a simple argumentative structure, right? Here what we're doing is, now that we're in college or university, we're developing our argumentation skills much more thoroughly. So, you may have a premise, but is it really possible to argue that, to investigate that particular premise, to support that premise thoroughly in a single paragraph? Not likely. All right. What is your premise? How does it support your thesis? How is your premise justified? What facts evidence, research can you supply as support for it? Are there different bodies of evidence or support that you wish to develop in separate paragraphs that pertain to this particular premise? Have you explained how the evidence you've provided supports the stance you're taking? So, for example, have you provided a warrant to follow up on your evidence? Evidence is not self-explanatory, right? What's a warrant? Well, a warrant's like an if-then statement, right? A warrant of some kind is needed. If evidence X, then position Y is justified, something like that. Are there objections or possible counter-evidence that you might anticipate? What are these objections and how would you respond? Not that you have time for this right now, but one fellow who's really good at this is Thomas Aquinas. you can find him if you Google New Advent. It's a big website, big Catholic website, and you just look for New Advent Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. Just look at the way that he organizes his own investigations, argumentative investigations. Structurally, he does exactly this, right? He looks for objections and counter evidence, and then he replies to the objections, right? So, are there objections or possible counter evidence that you might anticipate? What are these objections, and how would you respond? Can this premise be effectively articulated as a single concept, or is it a complex phenomenon with various components? If so, shouldn't you explore them each, or shouldn't you explore them, each of them? I guess that's a crap sentence, sorry about that. So, you want to go beyond the 5-paragraph essay structure. It's good to, if you're struggling and you still just, aren't at the point where you feel like you can do this, at least work with the 5-paragraph essay theme, right? But then, once you feel like you get the basic sense of how to write a basic argument, now is where you want to grow outside of that and develop your writing so it becomes more nuanced and your ability to argue becomes more rich. So, here you've got a nice little flow chart for how to go beyond the 5-paragraph essay theme, right? By dealing with each of your premises more thoroughly, your paper moves beyond the 5-paragraph essay form. So we start with your thesis position, or you state your position on the issue, and then you have your series of claims, right? So there's premise 1, for instance, and then with premise 1 that supports the thesis, right? You then, you offer up some evidence, some facts, some research, if it's quotations, whatever, and then you're explaining with your warrant, right? You're explaining how these facts that you just provided support the premise, which in turn supports the thesis. Again, this just comes down to the simple fact that when you offer up a quotation, you just don't end the paragraph with a quotation, right? That's one of the first things I was taught in university by a friend of mine when I was struggling with writing. He was quite good at it, and he says, don't ever end with a quotation. Always explain how that quotation relates to your point. So that's what your warrant is, basically. And then also think about, what might be said against this premise or the evidence you've provided. So are there possible counter arguments or counter evidence? And then how could you respond to this objection? See how much more rich that is than just the 5-paragraph essay theme we learned in high school, right? Where you just say, here's my premise in support of my thesis, and here's my evidence next, right? And my next and next and next. Here you're being a little bit more careful to nuance and to enrich each component of your argument. All right. If you're serious about learning to write, you need to pass your paper through the processes of revision and editing. Both take time, and they're not the same thing. I think that revision and editing are the two things that people don't understand nearly as well. Like, I think people just blend them together and say they're the same, but they're really not the same beasts at all, right? Revision is about transforming. It concerns content, organization, and language, right? So, content. Through the pre-writing and drafting stages, the writer may develop a new conception of where the whole piece wants to go. Organization. The writer may rearrange sentences and paragraphs. The writer will probably want to add transitions in and out of paragraphs and from sentence to sentence within paragraphs. And then language. The writer should be upgrading vocabulary to be interesting, varied, and appropriate for the audience. The writer should also be combining sentences, eliminating redundancy, and using other rhetorical techniques that make the language more powerful and efficient. I think my first encounter with revision was, I think it was either at the end of my undergrad, or it might have been in my master's. But anyway, my professor back then, he's the best professor, honestly, at McMaster there, and it was either my undergraduate thesis or my master's thesis. I wrote the draft. And I was so happy because it took me so long, and it was so hard, and I learned so much, and I was like, this is done now, right? And I didn't think there was going to be much more to do. And my professor, my supervisor, he went through it. And I don't know, like maybe a week later, he gave it back to me. And he'd taken scissors to it, and he'd taken paper clips and staples, and he'd tape things, and he'd move things around, and he'd cut things out, and he'd put, something in the front that was in the back, and something that was in the back and the front, and then shuffled things, and I was like, whoa! I didn't know what had happened to the paper, and I was like, oh my God, right? And he'd written all through it and everything. But that was the first time that I'd ever been taught to really revise anything. I'd never seen that before. And he cared that much about me to do that. Right? How many teachers or professors actually care to do that? He demonstrated such care and concern to help me with my writing. And I always remember that, and I've always been thankful to him ever since then. His name's Dr. Plinitz in McMaster University. They're a really wonderful professor. But that's how you revise, ladies and gentlemen. It's just, you get in there and you just get right down into it, and you just tear things up, and you look and you reshuffle. That's revision. That's different than editing, right? What's editing? It's just correcting. It's grammar and subjects and verbs and, agreements and pronouns and usage and spelling and, so often I think we just skip revision, right? We just skip it and we go down through and, edit your work. And then so when a student comes to you, in high school, I worked so long on this, and I went through and checked my paper. Probably what they did was they hit the spell check, and there were no red lines, or there were no green lines under the grammar, and so, or there were some, but they didn't understand how to fix them, so they just left them. And then they're like, I don't understand, that I changed everything, and I worked so hard on. No, you did the basics of editing, perhaps, but you totally overlooked revision, and that's why it's still full of all these difficulties, is because you skipped over revision. And revision and editing are not the same thing. So here's, a couple checklists that, teachers give students in high school. You could use them in college or university as well, right? A revisions checklist. Did I write what I wanted to write? Is my topic focused? Will my readers understand what I'm saying? Is my writing clear? Is my opening strong? Does it capture the reader's attention? Are my main ideas supported with details? Have I used examples? Does my conclusion contain a final point or summary for my piece? Is all my information needed? Are there any words, phrases, sentences, or paragraphs that I can cut? Have I cut all clutter? Are there places I can expand my ideas? Does my piece show unity? Do all of the parts build to a whole? Are my paragraphs unified? Does each one contain only one main idea? Is the style right? for the subject? Is my style consistent throughout the piece? What part of this piece do I like best? Why? What part do I like least? Why? What part do I feel needs improvement? How can I improve it? Right? There's a revisions checklist. Right? If you had to write, say you had to include one of those with every paper you wrote as part of your demonstrating that you move through writing processes, think of how much better your writing would become. And then similarly, right, here's the blue one, an editor's checklist, right? So this is quite different. Sentences begin with capital letters, correct ending punctuation, sentences are complete, paragraphs are indented. I mean, you can go through. It's very different sorts of nuts and bolts kind of things, right? But that's why these things are two different, separate elements of writing processes. Again, very often we think because we went through and we checked our spelling and checked our grammar and put capitals where capitals belong and periods or punctuation where that belongs, we think we've done our job, but we actually haven't if we've skipped through revision. And revision is the place where all the real deep improvements in your writing will come from. Okay? So there you go. A little bit on writing processes. The next and final installment in this series is all about how to conduct effective research.